It's Sunday, October 9, 2022, and welcome to the 34th episode in this series from MeidasTouch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can subscribe as audio, as a podcast, in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get yours. Joining me today is investigative journalist, technologist, and historian David Troy. David, hi.
Hey, glad to be here, Anthony.
I've seen some of your TED Talks. I've kind of been very interested in the way that you kind of explain some of the insecurities of the planet. It seems like so many things that are happening in the world right now are kind of interlinked. And that's really what I'd like to kind of ask you about today, because just incidentally, a couple of days ago, Joe Biden declared the risk of nuclear Armageddon is at the highest level since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This is as Russian officials are now speaking of using tactical nuclear weapons after suffering these setbacks, because right. Ukraine is now being well stocked. So that's something that I think we'll start with. But I also then want to talk a little bit about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. This is after, on Thursday, the North Carolina man pleaded guilty with other members of the far-right group, the Proud Boys, to violently stop the transfer of presidential power after the 2020 election. His name's Jeremy Joseph Bettino, and he's now cooperating with the Justice Department's investigation. So, the rise of the right in the US and around the world, and increasingly we find that if you watch right-wing media, if you follow social media and you see the right-wing rhetoric, they seem to now be on the side of Putin.
Yeah, this got started really, many years ago. In fact, the roots go back to at least the mid-'90s. There was a group that got started in 1995 called the World Congress of Families, by a fellow named Alan Carlson, who was a professor, I believe it was at Hillsdale College. But he was traveling in Russia, and, he had this kind of revelation that there were a lot of people in Russia that shared what you might call family values or Christian values. And so he started to network quite a bit with people in the Russian Orthodox Church who were pursuing agendas, really against homosexuality, against abortion, things like this. So, really created this kind of right-wing network between the U.S. and Russia, as well as counterparts in Europe and in, other parts of the world who were very interested in kind of this right-wing agenda. And so, that network started to kind of flourish in the, mid to late 90s. And over the course of the subsequent 20 years, really became quite a clearly defined force. So there was an essay that Pat Buchanan, the sort of Republican firebrand strategist in the United States, wrote, called "Whose Side Is God On Now?" I believe it is, and the essay basically suggested that God was on Putin's side because Putin was siding with these traditional family values. And there's this whole, line of argument around making Moscow be the third Rome and kind of creating a restoration of Christianity between Rome and the Orthodox Church. And so that became kind of the through line through which a lot of this current sentiment started to grow. And then now what we're seeing is almost like, if those were the mycelial threads that had been woven over the course of decades, what we're seeing now is the fruiting body of the mushrooms, and let's hope it's not a mushroom cloud, that comes from all of this mycelial networking. So this has been building for a very long time.
I want to talk about how God and religion is, used as an excuse for atrocities
Sure.
in just a little bit. Let's start with Joe Biden this week. This psychological warfare, it's like a game of poker, isn't it? It's like he's got nukes, we've got nukes. He might use the nukes. We don't want to use the nukes. This whole back and forth. It's and for Joe Biden to come out and basically say that use the Armageddon word, which is a It's a big word, not just in
very
letters.
loaded, and people,
It's
get
very,
very
very
nervous with
loaded.
it.
I mean, that is, especially for a Democrat to use language like that. I mean, you can understand Donald Trump kind of, the big guns, but I mean, he's on Putin's side anyway.
Right.
So for Joe Biden to use this rhetoric, I mean, how, I haven't lived through any kind of nuclear kind of, as an adult, I've not lived through any kind of nuclear
We're
political.
younger than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I a little bit, yeah, just by about 12 years. But, I mean, how does this play out, Dave?
Yeah, so, I've been coming at this from maybe a little bit different angle than some analysts. And, I have a pretty good network of folks with, a lot of foreign service kind of training and, international relations and all of this kind of stuff. So I balance a lot of what I'm seeing against, their viewpoints, and I try to create kind of a synthesized viewpoint. But basically, what I kind of see with this, at least from the perspective of looking at the information warfare that is out in the wild and the kind of messaging that's, being put out from people like Alexander Dugin. And I think it's important to stress that, I don't think that, Alexander Dugin is whispering in Putin's ear, and I don't think that Putin gets all of his ideas from Alexander Dugin, but they are drawing from the same kinds of cultural well springs. And, all of it is tied back to Eurasianism. You heard Putin in his speech the other day mentioned Ivan Ilyin, the Russian nationalist poet, who really set into motion a lot of the ideas that are behind Russia's current strategy. And so, you also have philosophies like Russian cosmism, which are extremely, rooted in almost, anti-Darwinistic views of science. I mean, there's a lot of superstition and ideas of upheaval and whatnot that are at play here. So the thing that I see is that because Putin sees this as a kind of irreducible conflict that cannot be resolved through diplomacy, that cannot be resolved really ever, he is forcing the will of his country to take the planet in a different strategic direction.
And he's killing his own people in the process, isn't he?
Because and as many as
with conscription, he's just sending people to the death.
He's convinced himself that this is a holy cause, and that, and I use the word holy in a kind of a syncretic way. It's not necessarily any one religion. It's his views. He sees that as a big idea that's worth supporting with the lives of all of his countrymen. And so, this kind of irreducible conflict, I think, puts us into a position where, he's very likely to, use nuclear weapons of one kind or another. Now, all of the speculation amongst kind of military type folks and, policy type folks is that there'll be tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield to achieve either shock and awe or some kind of battlefield objective that will hopefully turn the tide of the war in his favor. I come at it.
He's already used dirty bombs, though, hasn't he? Do you remember when he blew up the hospital and I forget what they're called, but they cause some kind of ricochet where it just blows all the windows
it's cluster
out.
Munitions,
right?
That are very dangerous. So, I do think that there's a possibility that, he might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And one reason why he might do that is because Ukraine is not officially allied with anybody and, wouldn't trigger an Article 5 response necessarily. But I think you have to also look at the fact that the statements that have come from Putin and his peers are that NATO is invalid, NATO is dishonest, NATO doesn't really believe the things it says. So what they've kind of convinced themselves, I think at least partly, is that Article 5 isn't really valid and that they want to show the hypocrisy of NATO by proving that we will not actually respond to a threat and a trigger of Article 5. Now, you have to get yourself into a pretty special headspace to actually believe that. But I think that, the evidence suggests that that's possible, that they are in that kind of a headspace. And I also think that given the way that, they conceive of this situation, a lot of what they might try to do is to influence Western populations in democracies to stop supporting Ukraine, because really that's their only pathway to achieving the results that they want here, is to lose the support, for Ukraine to lose the support of the West. So
and that's already happening, isn't it?
Well, there's starting to be some cracks that they're starting to try to amplify and widen, but in order for, if there was some kind of nuclear detonation, that would have a big impact on, let's say, the support of Germany or France, who are, right there, and they feel like that their interests are directly threatened. Plus, you already have a large peace-oriented faction, in those governments. I think that there's a lot of Russian infiltration, say, like in the German government. So, it's not ridiculous to think that they might be able to sway public opinion in that way. And that's, I think, kind of what's going on right now.
There's some evidence to suggest that Putin's nuclear arsenal is actually not quite up to standard. There were some images recently of rockets being tested and blowing in all directions.
Right.
I mean, we've seen that with some of their equipment as well, right? Some of their tanks and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all left over from the Cold War. I mean, is he really armed? Does he have the capability, or is this all empty threats? Is he doing a kind of Saddam Hussein, kind of poker face, I've got the weapons and I'm going to use them and it'll turn out to be minimal?
Well, I mean, I think, you have to look at the fact that they have a tremendous number of weapons. And, there's just, I think, thousands of, nuclear warheads of various kinds. But there's a lot of stuff that they've built and, are deploying that's really recent, so there's this Belgorod submarine that's, massive and is able to deploy these really huge Poseidon missiles. And all that stuff dates from like 2015 to 2018. Based on the analysis that I've been able to do, which is tracking a lot of different signals and making educated guesses, it looks to me like if they're going to do something, it's going to be submarine oriented, because I think that's where they actually have capability. And I think that they are looking, they've put out videos and stuff that suggest that they're looking at doing weapons that can create tidal wave type events. And, they wanted to submerge, Britain with a big, radioactive tidal wave from a massive, I forget what it was, 100 megaton or something, explosion from this Poseidon submarine. And they're talking about testing that submarine now up in the Kara Sea in the Arctic. So, and there's been chatter around a potential, submarine nuclear deployment potentially in the Black Sea. So, I mean, this could all be bluster, or there could be something to it. What I feel like is that they would want to do something that tries to expose NATO as hypocritical, that would be maybe of sort of, it might cause questions in terms of how we actually respond to it in the West. And mostly it would be an informational weapon designed to shape public opinion. I just don't see that this solves anything for them on the battlefield. I think it's much more likely they're going to try to shape public opinion.
And there is mutiny in the ranks, isn't there? We've heard in the last few days about the fact that not everybody in Russia, certainly in the Russian government or the Russian military, shares Vladimir Putin's intent to take Ukraine in this way.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely power struggles too. You've got Prigozhin, who is criticizing, upper leadership. Shoigu. They're all sort of vying for primacy and trying to get. I suppose there's also the potential for Putin to be potentially deposed. But, a lot of folks have suggested that, the next person that would be likely to take over from him would be Patrushev, who's currently head of the security service. So, I think it's difficult to say how that might play out internally. But, yeah, there's definitely dissent. And then the other question is that a lot of people have is, if Putin gives some kind of nuclear fire order, would it be followed? And,
right.
It's happened in the past where things like that have not been followed. So that's another possibility for ways out of this.
Let's just talk about, NATO is something that protects countries, keeps countries together. It's an agreement that effectively keeps us all safe. Donald Trump was this close to pulling America out of NATO and spoke very negatively about it during his tenure.
Right.
What kind of effect do you think that had? Because I'm very interested in the link between Donald Trump's presidency and Vladimir Putin's desire to go into Ukraine once Trump's presidency was up. Because a lot of academics are suggesting that there is a link, and the polar opposite to an academic is Donald Trump, and he has said this would never have happened if I was still president. So let's just deal with that, shall we?
Yeah, sure. So I know that that's been the subject of some speculation. My feeling is that, the evidence suggests that, Trump and the people around him have generally been sympathetic to Russia's, desires. And, as you talked about, was considering pulling the U.S. out of NATO, which would have really been a blank check to Russia to go do kind of whatever they wanted to in Europe. Because nobody besides the U.S. Inside of NATO would have really the sort of heft to respond to, those kinds of threats. So, I can't help but see, Trump as effectively preparing the soil for Putin and the things that he wanted to do, and really, his presidency as being in service of Putin's goals. I think, you could have suppose, for instance, that Putin, did his initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the plan was, more or less in 8 or 10 years, we're going to do the rest. And, he could have had that plan regardless of who was president. And if Trump had been president, it probably would have been a lot easier. It's given that Biden was president, it created more trouble for him. But I also think you have to look at Putin's, move here, not so much in terms of territorial desire for Ukraine, although it is definitely that. It's also an assault on the system of state sovereignty that, has been in place since the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648. And, that being the notion that every state has a right to determine its, sovereign destiny and all of that. So effectively what Putin is doing is saying, I don't really think that's how stuff works. I think I'm going to do things my way. And so, the notion of which president it happened under and all this, I mean, whatever. If you're going to if your life's legacy is going to be to upend Westphalian sovereignty, the exact moment you make the move, I'm not sure is material here. And I think that Putin felt like that he had already laid enough informational groundwork in the U.S. and the West by way of Trump's presidency and the other kinds of networks that he built in Europe to make this a viable move now. And I just don't know that it would have made any difference as to who was president, whether he would pursue this or not.
Let's talk about the technology that they use. And we know that Russia were heavily involved in manipulating the 2016 election, certainly the Brexit referendum in the UK. What are their technologists doing now to kind of make people around the world try and see it from their perspective? Because obviously Russia is a bit of a closed shop in terms of the internet and broadcasting, and so a lot of Russians think that the war in Ukraine is a holy war and they're on the right side with Putin. But in territories where they don't control the media or the internet, how are they convincing some Republicans even that, certainly here in the US, that Putin is the man to support?
Yeah, so I think one has to look at the term technology as being a very broad term. I mean, this isn't just about, sort of Facebook ads or, and that was the focus of a lot of early discussion of this. And it also isn't just about elections. It's really about political technology, which is, the practice of shaping the political landscape to suit the ends that you're trying to achieve. It's also about information warfare and narrative warfare and trying to build up networks of people who support your points of view. So, for example, as I said, this pro-Putin network, goes back really, to laying the groundwork in the 90s and then, really gained a lot of ground starting in around 2014. So, creating networks of people who support alternative narratives of how the world works and should be, that those kinds of networks just grow and grow and grow. And if you, particularly through social media, you can find ways to amplify and gain followers for those types of networks. And, we see a variety of pro-Russia networks, certainly in the U.S. Now, the question always is, how big can those sort of alternative networks become, and can they actually alter outcomes in a democratic environment? And, oftentimes, yeah, they can, because if you're talking about peeling off, 10, 12% of people into some alternative set of points of view, that's material in a first past the post democratic contest, which is what we live with here in the United States. A little bit different in parliamentary systems, and there's, variations around the world. But bottom line is that, that kind of information narrative warfare is very effective, and you don't need a ton of people to be converted to the points of view in order to have a very massive effect. And, and we talk about support for Ukraine, if the votes are currently, relatively balanced, between pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine, then, you only have to work the margin of a few percentage points to shift the outcome. Now, in fact, I think in America, people are overwhelmingly supporting Ukraine in terms of, an electoral context. I mean, it's something like 74% or something like that. And you saw when Elon Musk the other day tried to propose, that we discontinue doing this, supporting Ukraine. He was pretty roundly smacked down by American audiences, certainly. But Russia
I wanted to mention Musk. I mean, he's certainly somebody who shouldn't be meddling in politics. And if he does take ownership of Twitter, then he really will have wield a huge amount of power. But his tweet, I think it was on Wednesday, said, assuming you believe that the will of the people matters, we should, in any given conflict region, support the will of those who live there. And then he proceeded to kind of post a map of Ukraine from 2012, showing kind of pro-Russia sections. I mean, this is very dangerous, isn't it? Because, since his offer to buy Twitter, which now looks like it's going through, and the kind of fight, the criminal case against him.
Probably it'll go through. We'll see.
Yeah. The case against him has now been put on hold so he can, raise the money.
Yeah, I think he has until the 28th of October to close the deal, and then the case will resume.
To find like $40 billion.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere. Go check his couch.
Yeah, exactly that. So I'm just really interested in how people like Elon Musk, who present themselves as kind of apolitical, initially a few years ago we found out that like secretly he'd been donating to the Republican Party. And so that was like the first sniff of, oh, hang on, is Elon Musk... Because he's just seemed, because he was into electric cars, like a Democrat. I mean, is it crazy that we would suggest
there was
that?
A conception that people that were operating in Silicon Valley were mostly progressives,
Right. And so now we find that actually he's somebody who's quite prepared to lay his cards on the table, is doing this whole kind of free speech opinion, which it's just not, it's untrue. I mean, it's really not based in fact.
Right.
A lot of it, I guess, is a negotiating ploy for reducing the purchase price of Twitter. But at the same time, there are a lot of fans and followers of Elon because they think of him as being a kind of Tony Stark style character and somebody who, we should be supporting. And there are people who are now thinking, well, if Elon says it's the right thing, then maybe it is.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character and somebody that I've been keeping an eye on since about 2020 from like an information warfare perspective, because he started to kind of, do some kind of strange things in terms of trying to kind of warp the information landscape. And it became clear to me that he was kind of engaged in this whole network of shifting interests, let's just say. But, I think we know now more about kind of his ideologies and the kinds of people that he's networked with. We saw from the, text message exchanges that he was sharing, with respect to the Twitter deal, that, he's in touch with a whole variety of really, pretty hardcore libertarian thinkers, people like David Sachs, Joe Lonsdale, other people from like PayPal, Jason Calacanis. I mean, these are people that are pretty libertarian in their orientation. And, he's also very much part of this whole long-termism movement, which is actually a kind of repackaging of Russian cosmism, it turns out, which is another interesting rabbit hole to go down. But basically, what I believe, Musk and some of his peers really are looking to help drive is a kind of post-democracy world. Like, this isn't about gaining control of the American democracy and being the ruling party. This is about shifting to a totally different kind of governance model. And as best I can tell, the sort of model that they're plugged into is something called noocracy, which is the idea of a kind of rule by the wise that would also be informed by direct democracy. The idea of like giving everybody an app that they can use to vote on daily issues, and that this would be done at different scales than perhaps we're accustomed to using right now. So it might not be that there's, maybe the United States doesn't exist anymore. And instead of the United States and Maryland and California and New York or whatever, people are voting based on other categorizations and criteria. And so they're very much, and you have to kind of go like, oh, well, that's a big vision, Like, we're going to overthrow all the world's governments and replace them with an app. But I think that's kind of what's in their heads. And, there's many steps between here and there, obviously. But I think that's kind of the model. And the more that, you read about kind of the ideas that are underneath a lot of this, there's a Rand corporation report around noospherics and noopolitik and all of this. These are real ideas. I mean, they're out there. People are.
And they're not all bad ideas because, arguably, use Kentucky as an example where Mitch McConnell has like one polling place and people have to travel for hours to get to it to vote, which keeps him in power. Voting with paper in person is very antiquated. And I've always said for years, I used to say this on the radio like 10 years ago, if they can use an app for people at home to vote on Dancing with the Stars, then why can't we use that for democracy? If it's secure and if it's safe, then surely you will get a greater consensus that way. But it depends who the puppet master is, doesn't it?
Well, there's also asterisks to that. I'm friends with one of the leading election security experts, who's a Johns Hopkins professor. And, he has he and other peers have evaluated technical solutions for voting. And the problem is that there really isn't anything as secure and as good as paper ballots. However, it certainly would be more convenient, and maybe you could increase participation. There's a lot of other trade-offs to consider besides security. But if you want security, paper's the way to go. Now, the reason for that is partly because, these systems, if they are digital, they become, huge targets for manipulation, and it's very difficult to know if they've been manipulated, ultimately. So, there's a whole big, long list of technical reasons why that's the case.
But if there's bamboo in the paper, Dave, then there's a good chance that China were behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
Remember that one. So, it's very interesting to me that we are living in a world that is, people refer to the world as getting smaller. And obviously information and technology is behind a lot of that, as well as, it used to be the case that like hub and spoke airports made the world smaller. You could get places. Right. But now technology is making the world smaller because we can, I do crazy things, and forgive me just for a moment, but if I want to go and spend the afternoon in another country, there are people now who walk around cities with a gimbal and a camera. And they just walk. And I put it on my big TV and it's in 4K and I feel like I'm walking around Cairo or London if I miss it. And they only filmed this like 2 days ago and it's already up. Right. That's a very recreational thing and is at one end of the spectrum. But it's making the world smaller. And also, there are some, certainly, I think America right now is saying, Cairo's not a great safe place to visit. So, well, I'll just watch it in 4K at home, then, right? But what the technology does is it enables people to take an interest in other democracies and other processes and wars. I mean, I remember the Gulf War, the first time we had live video pictures of those Scud missiles. Do you remember that? And
Sure.
it was compelling. I mean, it was compelling to watch that type of stuff on television. But the tragedy of all of this is that the kind of organic nature of reality disappears and is replaced with a technical version. I mean, I'm not getting Cairo. I'm getting some guy's walking version of it.
Simulacrum of Cairo.
Right.
Through somebody's phone.
And it's the same with warfare and everything else. Like it's very hard for us to have true empathy when we're just relying on Elon Musk's opinion or some, video playback, right?
Yeah, well, the thing that I've kind of identified as being key to all of this is really the influence of and the undocumented kind of process of the creation and destruction of social capital. And by that, I mean the ties between us socially. We exist in this very complicated sort of highly textured world that you can do all kinds of amazing things. I mean, the notion that we're able to do this kind of a video call and, this is just normal now, it's amazing. And the fact that we can watch wars and whatnot remotely via social media channels and all of that. I mean, it's truly an age of wonders. But the thing that we, I think haven't really properly accounted for is the effects that it's having on us in terms of how we identify and how we connect with others. So, for example, if you talk about disinformation, well, what's the mechanism of action of disinformation exactly? You might ingest some piece of information. You go, well, that seems kind of true to me. And then you start going around and telling other people that, and it turns out, well, some of your friends don't really want to hear you talk about that, so they stop seeing you. You start hanging around with the friends that are more inclined with this stuff. You start watching videos and forming parasocial relationships with people online and groups and whatnot of people that believe similar ideas to you. And you've actually radically changed your social connections as a result of being drawn into these information networks. And that in turn has a big impact on your identity. Who you are and what you believe is so much in dialogue with your social relationships. So for me, that's kind of the unmeasured underlying force that we need to become much more competent with understanding and comprehending, because it isn't about disinformation. It's about how it changes us socially. It's about how it changes our identities. Because the more that we become drawn into radical beliefs, circles and social networks, the more radical we in fact are. And, that's going to lead to political violence. It's going to lead to intolerance. It's going to lead to upheavals and anti-democratic and illiberal movements taking hold. And that's exactly what we see.
The internet has forced this to be sped up. If you remove the internet from this entire equation, Dave, Al-Qaeda never had a headquarters. It existed online, effectively, right? It was fractions, and they were brought together because they had the technology to do so. I mean, and I hope Tim Berners-Lee is not watching this, because, he'll take full, I don't want him to take any more responsibility, but the invention
I know he feels
of the,
guilty already.
I think he probably does. That's why he doesn't go out much. The invention of the internet has encouraged political violence. It's encouraged extremism. It has enabled these organizations like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys to communicate not just in their small groups. And, think about how they did it before the internet. They would have to have they'd be pen pals effectively, or they'd have a meetup.
Very slow. Yeah.
Right, very slow. So in your opinion, as a technologist, I mean, how much responsibility does the internet take for this huge shift to the right, or to the what used to be the fringe becoming the mainstream?
Well, I think the internet, is an accelerant. It's a catalyst, like you say. It makes everything go faster. It also reaches everyone, almost everyone. So, the idea of whatever was going to happen happening a lot faster and reaching everybody, that's, I think, probably the biggest factor to consider. Now, that said, it has also made it very easy for all sorts of actors to reach people with whatever kinds of messaging they want to provide. And that, in turn, has given an opportunity for people to be corralled up and radicalized in different ways for a whole variety of reasons, worldwide. The other thing I think that, bears some responsibility is that there was a real sense, and I remember being part of this, back in the 90s, there was a real sense that, if we could just get everybody connected, that magic would somehow or another occur and, good things would happen. So, you had John Perry Barlow with his declaration of cyberspace independence and all this, the idea that, it should be left alone, and almost a very libertarian kind of mindset that, somehow or another information and the market for information and the free marketplace of ideas would result in some sort of magical outcome. And I think that what we've seen now is that that's just not true. It has led to a lot of weird, kind of fractal side effects that nobody could really anticipate.
But just seeing something in print, doesn't that authenticate it? I mean, this has always been my opinion. Decades ago, before the internet, if you wanted to have a voice, in England, we would have to write a letter to the Times newspaper, which started, "Dear Sir," if you had an opinion, right? And there was a 1 in a million chance that it would be printed. And if it was, you were like a local celebrity because, as an ordinary person, your opinion suddenly became part of the national conversation. Now everybody has a platform and everybody has a voice. And so, yes, it's more democratic, but it's also much more dangerous because if you see something in print, i.e. on the screen, and it's got let's say it's on some kind of website, Rumble or something, just the layout gives somebody's crackpot opinion or authority because it's suddenly in print, even though they typed it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, this lack of gatekeepers, has put a lot of responsibility onto, independent media producers like, you or me, who are trying really hard to be credible and, make sure that we, sort of conform to all of the conventions of, this medium so that, we can be trusted voices. And there's so many voices that really, don't even bother to, in fact, are, trying not to conform with any of those norms. So, I think that's a definite challenge. And, I think, that's certainly another piece of the landscape. The other thing that, I think we see exhibited again and again is the sort of drifting into cult behavior. And so one of the main things that I've had to do as a result of working in this space is become extremely familiar with the history of cults and how they work. So I work very closely with a guy named Steve Hassan, who's one of the leading experts on cults.
He's been on the show a couple of times, Steve.
Okay,
I recently watched your interview with him, and I do recommend it. It's fascinating. But isn't it crazy that he has come into his own now as given a lifelong study of cults, because cults was a word that we didn't really make that much use of, and suddenly it seems to be everywhere.
Yeah, no, I think it's truly the kind of defining paradigm of this moment, because this is this thing with social capital and radicalization, is that, we are basically pushing people, people are being drawn into cultish social formations. And, I have some analogies that I like to use with this. It's similar to, the theory of gravity, the idea of people sort of being drawn closer into each other with tighter and tighter social bonds to the point where it's very, very difficult for them to get out. Now, we are different from atoms in that atoms don't have agency and free will, but humans do, and so we can figure out ways to unwind ourselves from these high gravity situations. But cults are a little bit like social black holes in that regard. And what we've got right now, with the internet operating the way that it is kind of a machine for making black holes. And that's a very dangerous kind of phenomenon to be witnessing.
Let's talk about January 6th just for a moment. This is after this chap, Jeremy Joseph Bertino, has agreed to cooperate with the Justice Department's investigation of the role that the Proud Boys leaders played in the mob's attack on the Capitol building. They say that his cooperation could actually ratchet up the pressure on other Proud Boys charged in the siege, including the former national chairman Enrique Tarrio.
Right.
And what's very interesting to me, I'll just summarize before your expertise, but we didn't realize quite how coordinated January 6th was on the ground until recently. That it turns out that it was these militia groups, which you could also call cults, who were operating via Michael Flynn, and we're probably going to find out, aren't we, as this investigation rolls out. But they were basically waiting, not in their militia costumes, their military garb, but dressed just in regular black clothing, to open the floodgates, to remove the barriers, to fight the police, to then allow regular citizens to kind of go in and do the rest of it. I mean, it's kind of clever, isn't it? But it's also pretty terrifying, because there's been a lot of rumors for years about the Black Bloc and various groups who show up at protests.
Right.
Donald Trump has used this initially with January 6th. The right wing was saying, oh, well, it was Antifa that showed up. I mean, let's just talk a little bit about how these cults and these militia groups are infiltrating government, but also how government, in the case of the Trump administration, is making use of these. Roger Stone had Oath Keepers as his bodyguards.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, you've got all of these different, subgroups that have been deployed in different ways. The thing, and this really wasn't, totally clear until after January 6th, unfortunately. I think a lot of analysts, myself included, felt like that January 6th, was a potentially dangerous situation, because you did have a lot of these kind of right-wing type folks planning to be there. But up until then, there hadn't really been much of a target except for to fight with left-wing counter-protesters and that sort of thing. And given that situation, so many left-wing counter-protesters were told, do not go to Washington on January 6th. So the hypothesis was that there wouldn't be much of a conflict because the opposition wasn't there. And so these guys could go parade around and rally and whatever, but it wouldn't amount to much, because everybody assumed that the Capitol and other targets that could potentially come into play would be defended. And, what I think nobody really counted on was that there was going to be a kinetic warfare plan to actually infiltrate the building, to potentially compromise folks on the inside. Either, we still don't know what the deal was with Charles Flynn and why the National Guard wasn't sent for so long.
That's the brother of Michael Flynn, who so far has not lifted his head above the parapet.
Yeah, so we just don't know, even now, why there wasn't more of a defense of the Capitol, because, there's really no reason why the facility could not have been properly defended. It just seems like, there was both, lack of resources initially, and then when there were more resources needed, they were delayed. So, but the very clever strategy that they did, in fact, looks like use was, to basically, use a mix of these different groups. You've got the Oath Keepers, the First Amendment Praetorians, the Proud Boys, a variety of others that were actually kind of active units in terms of, planning and executing a siege of the facility. And then they were given cover by all of these randos, the QAnon shaman and all these other crazy people who were, frankly victims of information warfare. And they turned up, thinking that they were being part of some sort of populist thing. But in fact, it was a pretty carefully planned, military style coup that was, failed, but it was certainly attempted. And so I think, we'll find, with this fellow Bertino, he's pled to seditious conspiracy. So, that implies others. That implies that he's going to name names and provide information that will help to root out the rest of that particular conspiracy. And I think, we'll see similar things happening with the Oath Keepers folks too.
I was hypothesizing that a lot of this is going to end up at the door of the president's chief of staff. Mark Meadows, and
Right,
his cell phone, which I think is going to
Yeah.
turn out to be
Well,
the most crucial piece of evidence in this entire thing.
that and also the Secret Service messages that apparently have been now recovered and are in the possession of the January 6th committee. So I haven't been, focusing on the play-by-play of all the things that are being found out there, more than, say, a lot of people have. But, because there's a lot of people that are actively tracking all of that, and I'm kind of focused on some of the more Russia-oriented stuff right now. But, it's definitely, I think we're going to get some pretty good idea of what went down there. And it looks like, a lot of the people that were involved are starting to cooperate, which is good to see.
It's interesting that you separate Russia from January 6th, because there is an argument to say that they're intrinsically
It's kind
linked.
of the same thing, yeah.
And that Michael Flynn is the linchpin, because, as we know, he had these meetings with Russia. He is somebody who has communicated with Russia. He lied twice to the FBI about communications. He then got a presidential pardon in the last few days of the Trump presidency.
Right.
He's now going around the country with his own, created, it's called the Reawaken America Tour, launched by Michael Flynn. Let's just be clear, he's the former White House National Security Advisor.
Well, for a couple of weeks.
For a couple of weeks, yeah. But he very much remained in that role in a kind of unofficial way, I'm sure, because his communications would suggest that. With this, he has now teamed up with an Oklahoma entrepreneur called Clay Clark. This all started a few months after the insurrection, and attendees and speakers at these events that he's been hosting, they still insist, against all the evidence, that Donald Trump rightfully won the election. And these events are becoming increasingly religious. They are a little bit like those kind of evangelical Christian arena
tent
shows.
revivals.
Right. So just explain where, the anomaly that is Michael Flynn. I mean, he really is, but considering he's like a 4-star general or something, right? He's been in the military for decades. How many other Michael Flynns are in the military? I mean, certainly his brother, but I mean, this is insane. No one seems to really talk about the fact that this was a guy who was very much at the top of the U.S. military, who has turned out to be a complete lunatic.
Yeah, I mean, he's a traitor by any conventional measure. And, one of the things that I documented shortly after January 6th was just how many military and intelligence people, both active and retired, had been promoting messaging, related to QAnon and promoting January 6th and all of this kind of stuff. I just, in a fairly casual survey, was able to identify something like 40 or 50 people. That's the visible people that are out making media and, talking in public and networking with these, kinds of folks. How many other people are, sort of heads down a little bit more quietly on the inside? There's, various other kinds of movements. There's something called the Order of the Nine Angles. That is kind of like a weird, sort of Satanist type movement that's, trying to infiltrate the military. And they're doing so with the express purpose of getting training from the U.S. military and then using it against the country. It's like, okay. And so there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on, and it's quite disturbing. I think, it's easy to perhaps, I guess get into a frenzy over it. I don't want to overestimate the problem, but I also don't want to underestimate it, because there is a serious issue here. And we keep finding evidence of folks who, are really, not acting in good faith or with the country's interest or with, our global interests at heart.
But the extreme effect of this is Biden says, okay, press the nuclear button, and the person sitting there goes, no, I'm a fan of Russia. I mean, that's where this could end up.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the worst case scenario. But we have to consider, I mean, even in the case of Charles Flynn, and, look, I don't know, what's going on with him. I don't have access to his personnel records. I don't know what he's been interviewed about. And, I'm sure that this question has come up in some kind of way.
And Michael Flynn won't answer any questions about his brother. I've seen a few times people have put a microphone and said, "What about Charles?" And he literally cancels the interview.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, Charles is in charge of the U.S. Army Pacific Command. He's based in Hawaii. He would have purview over the Army's activities with respect to anything having to do with China and Taiwan. And we really don't know, the public doesn't have a good sense of where his loyalties are. He appeared to have been in the room when the decision to not send the National Guard was made on January 6th. The input into that decision, we just don't know. The Army actually lied about that. When asked about it initially, they said, no, he wasn't in the room. But then later they corrected themselves and said, well, no, actually he was. And so, it's a black box. And I would love for President Biden to, request that the Pentagon clarify his status. And, what would be the harm, just for example, of putting the guy on temporary leave for 6 months and reviewing the situation, and then if there's absolutely no issue and we're totally sure he's okay, put him back, or maybe put him in a different role. I don't know what the right answer is, but
maybe send him off with Louis DeJoy of the post office and let them take a vacation together.
They should go off somewhere together, and let's put some other people in place. So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah. I just want to talk a bit more about Michael Flynn and this Reawaken America tour. It's now carried its message of a country under siege to tens of thousands of people in 15 cities and towns. It's like a traveling roadshow and a recruiting tool for an ascendant Christian nationalist movement that's wrapped itself in God and patriotism and politics. Sure. It's grown in power. It's growing in influence inside the Republican Party. And it's all about Christianity, which they say should be at the center of American life and institutions. And we've already seen, with the packing of the Supreme Court and their decision on Roe and whatever else is to come there, but also suggesting that America is some way under attack and right. having to restore the nation's Christian roots. Yeah. I mean, that is in direct contrast to what the Constitution says. Which says that nobody should be forced to practice a religion that isn't of their choosing.
The founding fathers were expressly concerned with not having state religion.
Right. So how do these two coexist, and where do you see this ending up?
So this is a very complicated question, but the bottom line is that I believe that Flynn is using this, as a very cynical kind of just information warfare tactic. There was a document that one of our colleagues who goes on Twitter by Gal Suburban, she found a document from 2012 that Flynn had pulled together that basically outlines all of these psychological warfare strategies and using religion as an instrument to get people to start to erode their own state, that kind of thing, and to spark revolutions and whatnot. So my opinion is that we're a little bit overmatching on the idea that this is, about Christianity. It is somebody like Flynn is using Christianity as a tool to achieve the ends that he wants to achieve. If America was predominantly Sufi, he would be having a Sufi tent revival. It doesn't matter. This is a way to reach the audience that he wants to reach. And the idea of America being under attack and, potentially being at risk and all of this kind of stems from this, I would call it 100-year idea that, 100-year-old idea that, capitalism and communism are locked in some kind of, bloody eternal conflict, and the infiltration of communists into the United States presents an existential risk for the country. So the idea that we need to rise up and protect the country from the creeping communists, who also from their perspective might also happen to be anti-Christian and godless and homosexual and whatever else. It's just kind of a convenient coincidence. But it's a very cynical deployment of religion to achieve a specific end. And I would also note that, the fact that they're incorporating elements like baptism and whatnot, I wouldn't look at that so much as a dogmatic or doctrinal, fact, I would look at it more as it being an initiatic ceremony, which kind of creates a stronger bond between people in a movement. Any kind of initiatic group is going to have a much tighter, kind of more active social dynamic than one that doesn't have an initiation. So
it's also for fundraising as well, isn't it?
You know,
it's also Michael Flynn making a living. I sometimes think that people forget that people need to put food on the table, and you know, if you find a way where there is suddenly an income stream, then you tend to beeline towards it. If it means bringing the whole of the United States down with you, as in the case with Donald Trump, you know, then so be it. At least you'll be able to eat.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency that some people, you know, have to always just go, well, it's just a grift. You know, don't worry about it. They're just trying to make money. And I think, you know, as you say, you're also looking at something that has the potential to take down the United States. So in most of these cases, I would say that they're a combination of grift and geopolitical warfare. And in the case of Flynn, I think he's working for Putin.
Interesting. I think there's probably a lot more people working for Putin, and we'll probably find out in time. Yeah. It might be too late, though, obviously, not just because of the midterms, but the threat to democracy. I mean, I was reading about where America sits on the kind of safe, protected democracy list, right. And it's like 25th or 26th in the world, right? Right. The UK, where I'm from, I think sits at like number 12 or something. It's very interesting to me that maybe it's American exceptionalism, but people still talk about, you know, the greatest democracy in the world when, you know, you only have to travel to Scandinavia to find places where they have an actual functioning democracy. Yeah. It's broken now. Why do Americans still talk about it like it's in perfect condition? When, I mean, I refer to the insurrection as it did overturn the election. Because it delayed the certification, they were successful for a few hours.
In a sense, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sense of American exceptionalism. I also think that, you know, there's a sense of aspirationalism that exists in America that's always existed, where regardless of what we are what we think we want to be, right? Like, that's who we really are, is what we imagine ourselves could be in the future. So I think, you know, you kind of have to, you know, give a little bit of leeway, you know, to the idea of what our ideals actually are versus our ability to practice them. And I think, you know, on the whole, most Americans hold those kinds of very idealistic, you know, city on the hill kind of concepts as being very dear and core. And that's part of the reason why people like me, you know, and just average people who are concerned about the direction that things are going in, have taken, you know, so much of our time and our lives to really fight for those values and those ideals. Because, you know, from our perspective, like, we can't ever, you know, achieve those kinds of actual things in practice if we abandon those ideals. So defending the ideals is actually super important. So, you know, I think the answer to your question is kind of yes, there's all of those things happening at once. And, you know, I think the hope that people like, you know, I and others have is that we'll be able to steer this very large ship, you know, in a better direction, and hopefully get closer to living up to those ideals.
Just finally, the irony of this is that they say that the 2020 election was one of the most secure in history, because there was the fear all of the fear that Trump and everybody else had put into it. So it was secure. Trump's desire to take these results to the courts resulted in the courts saying, sorry, there's not enough evidence here. There's been no evidence to suggest and yet America's standing in the world in terms of democracy has dropped down the leaderboard. Isn't it interesting that even though it was the most secure election ever, it has dented America's democratic standing?
Well, I mean, you know, consider that up until January 6th, 2021, you know, we were very much in a position to take pride in the fact that we had always had a peaceful transition of power. It was no longer the case in 2021. And that was a real blow to our system of government and to our own self-image and to the reality of the American, you know, government. So I think, you know, while our election systems are in fact pretty good, there's also, the public perception and the idea of what it means to be governed. And, in order for, I think, a democracy to be deemed fully successful, most of the people, or at least you'd want pretty much everybody, like 90% of people to agree that, the system is working properly and that, the outcomes are fair and that they were truthful and all of that.
But
and
isn't that Trump's legacy? Trump's legacy is, well, if I don't win, then it was rigged. That's what he said. And that's what Jair Bolsonaro is saying now, copying the very same rhetoric.
Yeah.
Could we, is it fair to say that of all of the horrific stuff that went by during the Trump administration, not least the Sharpie extending the direction of the hurricane, that claiming that there was election fraud and when there wasn't is actually the greatest damage that individual one has done to the United States?
Yeah, I think that's among the most damaging things. I mean, certainly the assault on reality, the assault on truth, the idea that truth is a subjective thing, I think is very much the realm that we're in right now. I do think that reality has been kind of asserting itself, and we've been chipping away at aspects of that. But it's going to be a long battle to come back from this. If we do, I mean, we may just settle into some kind of new reality where there is people just say what they want and who cares. But hopefully we'll be able to come back from that somewhat.
Okay, we have to finish, but I've really enjoyed the chat. Thank you so much,
Yeah, absolutely.
David. Just tell us where people can find you if they want to look you up and read more about you.
Yeah, sure. So I am at davetroy.com is kind of my main page for just links to all of my different work. So I'm also at Dave Troy on Twitter. And I'm starting a new column for Washington Spectator that'll be out monthly, and also publishing long-form work there. I also have a podcast called Dave Troy Presents, which is available on all of the major podcast platforms.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5 Minute News daily podcast, which drops every morning. So you can hear me telling you what's happening around the world whilst you make your morning coffee. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.